Welcome back to the channel. I'm Xavier Smith, and today I'm going to give an introduction to evolution. What is evolution? Well, it's the cumulative change in a group of organisms throughout time. So, what does this mean? Well, evolution takes time. It isn't going to happen in a single generation. It isn't going to happen in 2 generations. It takes a long time. And in some species that reproduce very quickly, it doesn't take so long. But a group of organisms, it is not happening in one person. It's not happening in 2 people. It is going to happen in a group of organisms. Cumulative, it takes time. It takes time. It's slowly changing. More successful, fittable traits for the species is slowly adapting and working its way into the species' genome. So, how do we prove this? Well, the fossil record. And there are 2 types of traits that are commonly found. There are derived traits, which are newly evolved and not found in common ancestors. So, I don't know, you have feathers and your ancestors don't. Well, you develop that over time, probably because one of your more recent ancestors, not your ancient ones, not a common ancestor, but one of your recent ancestors might have had a genetic mutation, and then they're growing feathers, and it helps them survive in their environment, and then they reproduce more successfully, and that trait's passed on down to you. And then there's ancestral traits, which the name gives it away. It's more primitive features that appear in your ancestors. So it'd be like teeth. Well, my ancestors had teeth, so guess what? I have teeth too. That is an ancestral trait. Oh, natural selection. This is the way of evolution, as Darwin said. There's selective breeding, and Darwin thought that could lead to natural selection. Well, Darwin called selective breeding artificial selection, which means that people decide what traits they like, and then they can manipulate offspring breeding pattern. They can manipulate organism breeding patterns to produce offspring with desired traits. That's how we got all our dog breeds, all those things. And he thinks, since humans can do it, over time in nature, traits that are better suited for a species and increases reproductive success could just work their way into the genome and become a staple trait of that organism, and that would be natural selection. So it's artificial selection, but it happens over time in a group because a trait is more suitable for that species' survival, and it gets passed down generation through generation. And there are 4 properties that need to be in place for natural selection. Individuals in a population show variations among others of the same species. You and I look different. That's a quick example. Variations are inherited. You look like your parents. You get a little mix of both, but you get your parents' variations. So if your mom has blue eyes, you might also have blue eyes. You inherited it. Animals have more young than can survive on the available resources. It's how turtles, they give birth to, well, they lay eggs on the beach of a lot of turtles. Those turtles go in a little death race with all the birds and predators on land trying to eat them right when they hatch. And then once they get in the ocean, then they're attacked by all these fish and things, and only a couple or none of the turtles will survive. So the turtles with the best traits, maybe the fastest turtle, I don't know, could get a trait that makes him faster. He could survive. And then that trait will be passed on to the next generations because variations are inherited. So only some of the organisms that are produced as offspring can survive. And it's those that have the best traits. Variations that increase reproductive success will be more common in the next generation. Excuse me. So being faster increases reproductive success because that turtle's the only one that survives. Well, it's going to be faster the next generation. And guess what? That next generation is probably going to be a little bit faster because they got that variation. Let's keep going to some comparative anatomy. Very fun. What is comparative anatomy? Well, we're just comparing the anatomy of different species. So, we're talking about homologous, vestigial, and analogous structures. Homologous are anatomically similar structures that are inherited from a common ancestor. Excuse me. So my teeth, they are pretty similar to what my ancestors had. My skin looks pretty similar to what my ancestors had. My hair probably looks pretty similar to what my ancestors had. They're all homologous structures. They're anatomically similar structures that are inherited from a common ancestor. So reptiles, birds, bats, horses, and humans, we all had a common ancestor, and we know this because the hand of a human, the hoof of a horse, the limb of a reptile, the wing of a bat and a bird all look very similar in their bone structure. So we're saying, well, we probably had a common ancestor that had that bone structure, and it's homologous structures. Vestigial structures are homologous structures, so they're similar to what our ancestors had, common ancestor, but they are now in a reduced form and they're no longer used. So humans have wisdom teeth. They were used in our ancestors, but not used anymore. There are the appendix, probably used in our ancestors, not used anymore. They're not helpful. Then analogous structures are structures that are used for the same purpose, but are constructed differently and are not inherited from a common ancestor. So this would be an eagle wing and an insect wing. They are totally different. They are constructed totally different, but they have the same purpose, which is what matters here. And they do not come from a common ancestor. So we can say that the eagles and the insects don't have really a common ancestor that gave them the wings, at least. And what's really important about analogous structures is it shows that functionally similar structures can evolve independently in similar environments. It's pretty cool. That's another way of evolution. So if you're put in a similar environment and I guess your ancestors have the same traits, you're likely to develop the same traits. And I guess that's just support for evolution. There's more support for evolution. Embryology. So, mammals, when we're little embryos, little fertilized eggs, we all look very similar. So, birds and humans, we look similar while we're in that smallest form. So, what does that mean? Well, we probably had a common ancestor that looked like that. And I don't know, we just get that from our common ancestor. And that could support, well, mammals. Well, the mammals probably have a common ancestor because they're all mammals. But the difference is we all develop differently. So we look the same at the start, showing that we have a common ancestor, but over time we've evolved, gained different traits, and we develop differently. There's molecular biology, which means similar species share more similarities in complex metabolic molecules, which would be, I don't know, the DNA of a human and a monkey. They are quite similar. There's some variations in them, but they look really similar. While the DNA of a yeast compared to the DNA of a human, there's a good amount of variations there, which clearly distinguish the two. So we're more related to monkeys, which we've already known, and, well, they're mammals. So we likely had a common ancestor, and we just evolved a little differently from them. Biogeography, is a study of the distribution of plants and animals. What's important about this is animals could be separated, and then over time they could develop into different species or look very different, and that's just proof of evolution. Like the stickleback fish, they're in the ocean, and they have these little pelvic structures that have spines on them. So when a predator comes to eat them, it hurts the predator's mouth, and then they don't eat more stickleback fish. But those stickleback fish that don't have the pelvic structure, well, they're just eaten. And nothing wrong with that. But these stickleback fish, they do these things where they swim upstream and then they reproduce. So, during an ice age, these stickleback fish swam upstream, reproduced, but some of the offspring were put into a lake that had no natural predators. And over time, this pelvic structure, since there's no natural predators, wasn't needed anymore. It was now vestigial. So it slowly went away because it was no use. It didn't increase reproductive success. If anything, it might have decreased it, because it takes a lot of effort to grow one of those pelvic structures when you don't have to, because there's no predators around. So over time, while these stickleback fish are put in different environments, in the ocean there's a lot of predators, so they need those pelvic structures. But in Bear Claw Lake in Alaska, there's no natural predators, and the stickleback fish don't need the pelvic structure. So they're in different places, but they came from a common ancestor and evolved differently. So that's just proof of evolution. And it's the same species, but their physical traits are different. And evolution is linked to migration patterns, climate, and plate tectonics. So there could be in a species on Pangaea, then it separates, and now they're in different climates. One's closer to the equator, one's further away, and they evolve differently. And over time, their fossils, we could tell, look different. We're like, okay, well, then they evolved. They evolved due to their environment. Lastly, we're going to talk about adaptation. Adaptation. Well, first we're going to talk about fitness. Fitness is the measure of relative contribution an individual trait makes to the next generation. So, if a trait has a low fitness, it's not useful in the next generation. It's like a white moth in a black forest. It is easily seen, easily eaten. But the black peppered moth in the black forest is not easily seen, and that's a high fitness. And that increases the reproductive success of that organism, and then they pass their trait on to the next generation, and over time, the generation will evolve. Well, the species will evolve to be more black than white, because the reproductive success of the black trait is passed on, and it's got a higher fitness. And the two adaptations I'm going to talk about are camouflage and mimicry. Camouflage is when an organism evolves to blend into its environment, like a snake evolving to be gray. So if there's gray and white snakes, but they live in a rocky environment, the gray snakes blend in better and reproduce more, survive longer, while the white snakes are eaten. Then the gray snakes are going to reproduce, and over time, the species will be mostly gray, and they've evolved from white and gray to just really gray. Then there's mimicry, where over time, an organism evolves to look like another organism. Usually a harmless organism evolves to look like a harmful or a poisonous one. Like the king snake evolved over time to look like the coral snake. Coral snake is poisonous, king snake is harmless. But king snake has similar color patterns on it as the coral snake, so predators avoid it. And then there's more adaptations, like humans being born early. We are born really early compared to other mammals, and we are helpless, which isn't really a good adaptation. It's arguable, but the reason we may need to be born early is because we have big heads and we need to be able to fit through the pelvis of another human. So either you get a bigger pelvis or you are born earlier when your head's smaller. So we're born earlier and we're helpless. But those are just some adaptations. You can argue if that's helpful or not. But thank you for watching my quick introduction of evolution. Please subscribe if this helped you, and you can send it to anyone you'd like if you think they need help. Thank you. It really supports me.